Activate Your Introvert, the weekly show to help leaders build performance by understanding introversion. In this week's show, Introvert Myth of the Week. Introverts don't take risks. Leadership Tip of the Week, to consider habits more than goals. And a discussion with Mark Herschberg, examining the skills that are missing from what we're taught at schools. Mark is the author of The Career Toolkit. He's an instructor at MIT and startup CTO. We're going to talk about a possible cause of the extrovert leadership bias as well. Just before speaking to Mark, and following on from my previous comments about cuttlefish, I saw them in the news, and underwater again this week. Cuttlefish, according to the article, can remember their meals, preferences, and associate them with flags that have been waved. In conclusion, cuttlefish can remember what they ate, where and when. Another piece of science putting rest to the idea that fish can't remember anything. More importantly, this reminded me of a piece of neuroscience about introversion and extroversion, because I love science that shows evidence for extroversion. A research paper, Do Introverts Process Social Stimuli Differently from Introverts, by Fishman and Belugi, showed that there are different responses to images of faces in strong extroverts and strong introverts. Extroverts are often typified as having much more desire to spend time with people, deriving energy from doing so. The research suggests that this enjoyment of social activities and preference for social interaction over being alone might be associated with enhanced processing of social stimuli. It showed a difference in EEG responses, P300 to add some specificity, between introverts and extroverts when looking at faces, but not at other images such as flowers. The research doesn't prove causality. In other words, does introversion cause that difference or the other way round? But it does show us that introversion is not a made-up thing to avoid people, as some tell us is what's going on. The other news item I saw this week involved Delia Smith of Norwich City and cooking fame. I've long admired her cookbooks, and they populate my kitchen along with Jamie Oliver's. Delia's TV shows ran for decades from the 70s, and her books have sold more than 21 million copies. However, Delia views her career as something of a failure, because she hasn't achieved her real aim, which was to get people to learn to cook in their own homes. As she told The Times, people still don't know how to cook, so I wasn't that successful. It made me think about goals, which is probably more of interest to you as a leader. Goals are often espoused as something we should all have, review and work towards. Many leaders tell their staff what their goals should be, even if it's just in the annual appraisal system. My point about goals is twofold. Number one, telling somebody else what their goal is not likely to help that person's motivation or achievement. And number two, there are many people, not all introverted, for whom having goals is a negative thing. A goal is something you don't have, and focusing on things that you don't have is negative to some people, especially if it's not their own goal in the first place. Delia's disappointment at non-achievement of her goals, despite all the books and TV success, reminds me that as leaders we should not tell others what their goals ought to be, even if we believe in the goal system. Would it not be better to help people develop the right habits? Habits which help them to move in the right direction. However far they get in that direction, they will be better than they are now. After all, you are not what your goals are. You are what you repeatedly do. And so are your staff. Let me know if you agree or not, and if introversion has any correlation to that. Jump onto Facebook's Activate Your Introvert page to let me know. This show is all about understanding introversion and building business. What would you like to know about introversion in business? Lee wants to know, is introversion or extroversion real? Great question, Lee, so thank you. There's more information on the show notes, and for my quick answer, I'm going to come back to my earlier point and some of the other neuroscientific research that's been done. Some people may have questioned the initial work on introversion by Jung and said, it's not real. Fair enough. But since then, we've learnt a lot more. As we become able to watch what's going on inside people's brains and understanding their biochemical reactions, we become better able to answer Lee's question. So earlier in the show, I mentioned EEG responses being different to introverts and extroverts when looking at faces. Dopamine responses between introvert and extrovert have also shown to be different. There are other pieces of research showing some real differences between introvert and extrovert. For me, there's 3 important things. Number 1, everybody is somewhere on the spectrum. Not many people are at the extreme ends. Number 2, being a good leader means understanding, communicating with, engaging, and getting the most from all your people. So understanding personalities is important. Number 3, introverts do exist, and they're not often given the credit in an extrovert-biased world, and you can change that, at least for your team. What question would you like answered on the show? You're welcome to join me on the show. Go to activateyourintrovert.co.uk. But now it's time to chat to Mark.
Thanks for having me on the show. It's a pleasure to be here today.
It's great to chat to you, Mark. Thank you. We're going to talk about working effectively. We'll talk about communications, ethics, management. But just before we dive into that, are you an introvert or an extrovert? And probably more importantly, what's that meant to you?
I am an extroverted introvert. So by nature, I'm an introvert. I'm good with being alone. I was okay during this pandemic, staying by myself and reading and being in my apartment. I did miss people. I do like to socialize. In fact, I have lots of events and gatherings at my home. I'll have parties with 60, 80 people, also have smaller events. But even at those big parties in my own home where I have all these people, sometimes I need to hide in the corner or step outside for a bit because it can be overwhelming. So as much as I like that excitement of meeting other people, I do need that introvert's time alone to recharge.
I had some friends stop with me for a couple of days earlier this week, and it was fantastic to catch up with people after lockdown. But oh boy, was I tired by the end of it. Mark, you obviously do a lot of stuff with MIT, and we were talking about the skills that people don't learn in schools and university, college. Tell us a bit more about that and how that is relevant to business.
What we've seen across a number of US universities is feedback from corporate America saying there's a number of skills that we're looking for that we just can't find. These are the ones I teach at MIT, and these are the ones I put into the book. So roughly speaking, there are 10 skills in 3 different categories. Section 1, career planning, how to plan your career to get to the job that you want, how to be effective at work, managing your manager, understanding corporate politics and culture, how to interview people, not just be a candidate interviewing, but you're going to be involved in hiring other people, and chances are you've never been trained. Then there are leadership and management skills. And management, I break it down into people management and process management. The key thing about these skills, many people think, well, that's when I become a manager or a leader. But these are skills corporations want you to have from day one, and they will serve you even when you're not in a managerial position. And then finally, there are the skills that include communication, negotiation, networking, and ethics. All these skills in the US, in Europe, worldwide, these are valuable across all sorts of industries, all sorts of roles, but we unfortunately never teach them to people in high school or university.
Wow. And it's funny, I listened to the list and I thought, you're so right. It's just expected that we kind of learn them as we go on, I guess. Do you find any difference with things like that between introvert and extrovert?
I do, in that certain skills, networking tends to come more naturally to extroverts than introverts. How we tend to communicate is going to be different between introverts and extroverts. Leadership, I have a section in the book where I talk about how we have these perceived ideas of what a leader should be, and that's often more extroverted skills. So introverts often aren't perceived as a leader, even though they can be just as capable, even more capable, but they don't get perceived as such because they don't exhibit behaviors we associate with leadership. So there is a difference in these skills.
Leaders should be lines up with something I've said before, which is that there's an extroverted success model. leaders should be extroverts. I'm not quite sure why. What led you to that finding?
The thinking that I have as to where this comes from, and this granted is not serious academic research, when you look at the models that we had coming from mid-century, from that white male in charge corporate America, we looked for the leaders, the action stars that we saw on TV, the general barking orders, the Western gunslinger, right? These people who spoke their mind and were gruff and barked orders. And that was our role model. That's how we thought, well, these are the heroes we want to be. And so little kids grew up with that and exhibited those behaviors. And that's what we as society adapted as that's what we want in a leader. And unfortunately, I think we drowned out the other styles of leadership that might be more quiet, more introverted.
Ended up in a more complicated world now where those wider range of skills are needed. How can companies develop these skills in their organizations? What should a leader do to get more? I guess you need more employees that have these skills.
Ideally, you want everyone on your team or in your whole company to have these skills. The key thing is these skills are not learned the way we traditionally learn new knowledge. If you're trying to teach someone mathematics or history, or even here's how to use Excel or the new accounting rules, you get some instructor to stand up before the classroom and say, here's what you need to know, go memorize this, or you give them a book or a webinar. And that's great for transferring knowledge, but this isn't simply knowledge transfer. There's no 3 steps to being a leader. There's no algorithm for communicating that you just memorize and repeat. These are subtle, complicated, multidimensional skills. So the way you want to learn them, the way we teach them at MIT, the way they're taught at top business schools around the world is through a peer learning model. So get a group of people together, and it could be small groups of 6 to 8 people. There's ways to do it with larger groups of 20 or 50 people. Get some content, read it together, and then discuss it. So you can take a book like mine and chop up into little pieces and read this section, then together discuss it. And I'll hear how you would approach a problem. You'll hear how I would approach the problem, and we'll build out a richer understanding of how we can look at these situations. And just so you don't think this is me trying to get you to buy multiple copies of my book, you don't need my book for this. You can use this model, take other content, other great books, articles online, webinars, listen to a great podcast like this every week and discuss this. But it's in that discussion that you really build a deeper understanding of this skill set.
It's a really good point. The interesting thing is there, while you were saying it, I was thinking I can see many leaders going, no, we don't have time to do such academic stuff. I've got to focus on work. But then you ended up, and I was thinking, would it not work if we just use that approach in meetings where we actually all listen to each other's vision of what the problems were or what the things we were trying to develop in the company were?
If you took something as little as an hour a month to do this, to develop these skills, and if you think about it, you're regularly sending people to a 1-day training seminar, that's 8 hours. So now if you're doing an hour a month, that's about the same. And if everyone in your company got 1% better at communicating, 1% better at negotiating or networking or whatever skill you're working on, what would that do to your bottom line? It really does pay off in the long run.
When you were talking through the list of skills, one of the things you mentioned was how to manage your manager, which I thought, I can see many people not wanting to be managed by their staff. Expand on that one a bit.
So this has to do with your style and your manager's style. It could be as simple as if your manager's like me and not a morning person and you want to pitch me a big idea, as soon as I walk in at 9 a.m., don't say, okay, Mark, I want to sit down with you. I had this brilliant idea last night. I want to run through it with you. Okay, I'm not a morning person. I'd like to hear it in the afternoons. It could be, I want you to pitch it to me in person. Maybe I want you to do a write-up and email me so I can read it first and think about it before we discuss it. Different people have different styles. And going to introverts, extroverts, some people might prefer that face-to-face. Some people might say, send it, I want to read it. I'll respond by email. And so understanding how your manager likes to work means you can work in the style your manager's most comfortable with, and you're going to get a better result every time you have an interaction.
And so flipping that for a moment, it means that as leaders, we need to get better at helping our staff to understand us as well.
Absolutely. When I join a company and I sit down with my team and I say, here's who I am, here's my background, I also set expectations. Some are the behaviors or how I'm going to run the team, but also I give information. Here's how I like to work. Here's how best to engage with me and communicate with me. And that makes it easier for them.
How well do you think leaders understand the fact that these skills are missing?
I unfortunately think they might get it. Some of them might say, oh, yeah, I realized networking was important or these other skills were important. Yeah, other people should get them. They kind of know not everyone has them, but they don't consciously focus on what is that gap and how do we overcome it? Because so many people are just focused on the day-to-day interactions. How do I move the business forward? And they don't think about the strategic underpinnings like upskilling their organization that's going to help drive them forward with a better ROI in the long run.
And how well do you think leaders understand introversion?
I think here, for the reasons we discussed earlier, there is a bias that we get more extroverted leaders. And so it's harder for them to understand introverts. They're aware of them. They've heard of introverts, but they don't put themselves in an introverted mindset. And they don't think how will an introvert behave or react to this, or what can I do to better engage the introverts? I think leaders, unfortunately, lose out on some of the things introverts can bring to the table because they're not as focused on being inclusive to introversion.
Towards the end of the interview, I always ask my guests for a couple of tips. The first tip is for introverts, and the second tip will be for non-introverts. You can go in whichever way you would like.
I'm going to address them as one.
Oh,
because
controversial.
Extroverts need to be aware of introverts and vice versa. Now, we said a moment ago, yes, you're aware there are other people, but think about what that style means. Put yourself in their shoes. If you're an extrovert and there is a large, big meeting, some all hands meeting, and you want that kind of, everyone's just going to be shouting and talking at once with ideas, how is an introvert going to do in that situation? Will this bring out the best from that introvert? Will it generate good ideas and interactions from the introvert? Likewise, if you're thinking, hey, I want everyone to email me your ideas, will an extrovert who prefers that, let me just speak with other people and figure it out on the fly, maybe that's not going to bring out the best with the extrovert. So how can you create patterns that will bring out the best in both? So here's a quick example. When doing brainstorming, that's let's all sit around and just shout out ideas and then we'll call them later. I always begin my brainstorming with quiet brainstorming. Everyone write down your ideas for the next 3 minutes. So the introverts get a chance to quietly sit there and focus. And then, okay, 3 minutes are up. Now everyone, let's run through your ideas. And oh, if you had a new idea that just came up, sure, shout that out too. And now that works with the extroverts. And so it's a process that brings out the best in both of them because I give them the means that works for them.
Superb. And so, yeah, I completely agree with you about brainstorming, by the way. It puts off a number of introverts. And unless you find a way of drawing them in, you're going to lose out on what can be a really good creativity tool if managed properly.
Absolutely.
Some of our listeners will want to get back in touch with you to talk about some of this stuff. What's the best way to do that?
You can go to my website, thecareertoolkitbook.com, and there you can learn about the book, contact me, download the free app, or go to the resources page to learn how you can create these peer learning groups at your organization.
That's fantastic. Mark, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
And now it's time for Introvert Myth of the Week. Those crazy stories that I hear and you hear that some people actually believe. Introverts don't take risks. I've often heard this one from leaders, frustrated that they are not getting some of their team to try new things, to push the boundaries and put themselves out there. When working with leaders who believe this myth, I normally start by getting them to show me some evidence. It normally comes back to introverts not speaking up as much in meetings or generally in the company. If that's what you consider to be a risk, maybe there's something wrong with your management style or your meetings. But back to risks and introverts. How does a preference for spending time alone link to taking risks? Fears and desires are a completely different thing from extroversion. What do you consider risky activities to be in your business? I see no evidence that introverts won't take risks, where risks are things like trying new methods, experimenting with ideas, or standing up to bullies. Instead of counting introverts out for risky things, ask yourself if you've given everybody the right opportunity to express themselves, and choose whether an activity is something they're interested in doing or not. I'm John Baker. Thank you for listening. I hope you found it useful. There's a new episode every Thursday at activateyourinTrovert.co.uk and your favourite podcast provider. Till then, go be introversial, activating your introverts, building your business.